Episode number 353, Healing Racial Divides in Your Congregation, with Gary Chapman and Clarence Shuler. Let's do it.
This is the definitive podcast for helping you plan, create, and execute dynamic worship experiences at your church. Useful, practical content in the areas of production, worship, communications, first impressions, and more. This is Making Sunday Happen.
Hey guys, welcome to the podcast. Our podcast is part of the training arm of 1230 Media, and we have three buckets where we serve the church. One is ready-made media. That's media content that's done for you, ready for you to download and play. Our content is available a la carte or by subscription. Bucket number two is custom media. So if you're looking for a creative team that has a heart to serve Jesus and serve the church with graphics and video content all in one place, we're here for you. From announcement graphics, sermon series designs, sermon bumpers, trailers, promo videos, lyric videos, and more. There's a reason why churches and top ministries around the country trust us. Folks like Outreach, Mountain Park Church, Answers in Genesis, Awana, Atlantic Shores Baptist Church, the Southern Baptist Convention, and the list goes on. And our third bucket is training, and that's our free weekly blog, this weekly podcast, our books, and more. It's all a part of 1230 Media, and we, our entire team, have such a heart to serve you. We want to be here for you. We're relational. We're right there with you, and we just enjoy serving you. So thank you so much for trusting us and for listening to this show every single week. You can get started on all of that. If you want to use our services or learn more about us, you can go to 1230.media. That's 1230.media to get started. Well, this week on the show, I welcome two veteran ministry leaders, author of The 5 Love Languages and many other books. Dr. Gary Chapman returns to the podcast, along with another incredible author, speaker, and pastor, Clarence Shuler. Gary and Clarence have been friends for decades, and they wrote a book together on race relationships. So we're going to talk about healing racial divides in your congregation. We'll also talk about how that relates to the Sunday worship experience, what things you should be doing on stage and in your worship services that will help you reach more people in your community. But before we get to our conversation, I want to encourage you to grab their new book. It's called Life-Changing Cross-Cultural Friendships: How You Can Help Heal Racial Divides One Relationship at a Time. Many of us want to do something to improve race relations, but don't know where to start or even if we can make a difference. Each chapter of this book will guide you into a deeper level of understanding about what friendship is and about the benefits of cross-cultural friendships on an individual and a national level. So I want to encourage you to pick up the book today wherever books are sold. Well, let's dive right into my conversation with these godly men, Dr. Gary Chapman and Clarence Shuler. Hey guys, today I welcome Gary Chapman and Clarence Shuler. Gary is an author, speaker, and counselor. He's the #1 best-selling author of the 5 Love Languages series and director of Marriage and Family Life Consultants. Clarence is the president and CEO of BLR, Building Lasting Relationships. He's also a counselor, speaker, and the author of 10 books, including Winning the Race to Unity, Keeping Your Wife Your Best Friend, which I've read, great book, and others. Their brand new book, Life-Changing Cultural Friendships: How You Can Help Heal Racial Divides One Relationship at a Time, which they co-authored together, is available now. Gentlemen, welcome. Thanks so much for being here today.
Well, thanks for having us.
Yeah, we're glad to be with you, Carl.
Yeah, so Gary, this is your second time with me, so I hope I treat you right. And Clarence, we met last year at the Fatherhood Commission. Yeah. So I've seen you speak and with that. So you were really engaging and gave us some great tips there. So I appreciate both of you guys for coming back with me. Dr. Chapman, let's start with you. You guys have been friends a really long time, long before Love Languages started for you and other projects that you guys have worked on. So tell me a little bit about how you guys met and became friends.
Well, I met Clarence in a church gymnasium. I was a youth director, and on Tuesday night, we had youth night. And so I was there one Tuesday night with 100 young people, all of them white. And all of a sudden, they walked in the door, Clarence Shuler and his friend Russell, with their black faces. And
Black too.
yeah, integration had just started in the schools here in North Carolina. This is back in the late 60s. And some of our students had actually invited them to come. And so they were bold enough to come in those days. And our city was under a lot of tension. I mean, I remember the National Guard had been called out, on the streets and all this sort of thing. So I thought they were pretty brave young men. And I invited them. I mean, I made them welcome. And when the thing was over that night, I said, hey, guys, we're here every Tuesday night. You guys are always welcome. Yeah. And they started coming. So that's how we met. So
Clarence, give me the dirt on Gary. How has your friendship lasted so long?
Well, it's probably mostly him. He's just, when I met him when I was 14, he was just really kind. He came onto the basketball court. And so for us, kind of treat us with respect. And there was a sensitivity there. And I think one of the first times we met, Gary called us boys. And back in that particular context, that was not a good thing to call us boys, even though we were, but we'd seen our dads called us boys. So that was a real big deal. And so we sort of protested about that, but then we went to a Bible study because he came to pick us up. But after a Bible study, we sat in his car, my friend James, Gary, and I, and we talked about it. And so I was really impressed that he would really consider us as young teenagers worthy enough to have a conversation and would have that conversation. So we shared our perspective and he shared his. And that was just kind of, I think, made me and James feel we could trust him. And I think just proceeded after that. Probably 2 years after I met Gary, he introduced me to Christ. And then about a year later, 6 months, a year later, he began discipling me. So we really have had this ongoing relationship. And so probably for every important decision in my life, he's been involved with.
Man, that's awesome.
And our wedding, grandfather to my kids. So it's just kind of just perpetuated.
Yeah, that's awesome. So Gary kind of set the stage for with the book for us. Many pastors and leaders really want to improve race relationships in the churches that they serve and really want to reflect that on the stage and want to reflect that with their staff and things like that. But maybe they don't know where to start to make a difference. So how do you guys dive into this topic in the book? Well, how did the book start?
Well, Carl, I really believe that this is true, that most people, and certainly most Christians, really feel like, what can I do? I'd like to do something, but I don't know what to do. Because all of us see, the stress and tension in racial relationships in our country. And that's really what motivated me and Clarence to write this book, because we began to reflect on our friendship and what it had meant to us over all these years, more than 50 years now, and how he had influenced me and I'd influenced him. And which is what friendship is all about. It's getting to know the person. It's being there for each other. It's helping them understand each other's culture and understand each other, because, no two people are going to agree on everything, even if they're the same race or culture. But at any rate, we just really are convinced that here is a place to start. And this is something every Christian can do. And God is certainly in favor of it because Absolutely. God's children come from all cultures and all races. And so we thought, if we can kind of tell our story, and then we interviewed some other people who have cross-cultural relationships, that people could get the picture of, you don't just walk up to somebody and say, hey, I need a friend of a different race, Right. But you have a conversation with them, you start getting to know them, and just one thing leads to another. I think Clarence and I, neither one of us in those early years thought that we would be friends for a lifetime. And we weren't even thinking about friends necessarily in the early days. We were just relating to each other in the normal flow of life. And So I think in our culture, many people have acquaintances of a different race or culture. You know, if you go to work or you're in school or sports and so forth, you're going to have acquaintances. But this friendship goes much deeper than that. And if we each had a friend, and we're just saying, what if every Christian just had one friend of a different race or culture, a real friendship? And we believe it would change the climate, the emotional climate of our culture.
Do you think any of it has to do with identifying or labels? Meaning, like, Gary, I don't see you as a white man, or Clarence, I don't see you as a black man. I see you as Clarence. Like in our normal conversation, I just see you as Clarence. Is there any? Walk that out for me. What do you think?
Well, I think you do have to see me as a black man, but that should not keep you from building a relationship. I mean, it's very obvious Gary was white. But the way he treated us was not like the experience.
Especially his dance moves would show, and his basketball ability.
We won't talk about either one of them.
Okay.
It's clear, okay. But I think the thing is, it's not. A lot of people say I don't see color, and we talk about in the book that there's no such thing as being colorblind. Good. Unless you're actually medically colorblind.
Good.
So when you say that, especially people of color, you continue to make us feel invisible.
Good.
I think what's really important about the friendship aspect and the beauty of a cross-cultural relationship is, you know, today a lot of people are fighting over where you have critical race theory. Some are for it, some are against it. Some are studied, some have not. Some are struggling with the 1619 Project, or some are politics. You know, some are Democrats, some are Republicans. I think with Gary and me and what we're trying to recommend is if you build this friendship cross-culturally, particularly if you're Christians, it's not saying not to be interested in those other things, but that friendship really overrides a lot of the other things. And it helps you to process or see them in a different perspective. And I think the other thing is that Gary and I talk about in the book is that even as friends, we can disagree. We can have conflict. Never going to agree on everything. Right. But somehow our love for Christ should supersede all that. Good. And that I'm committed to Gary because God commands me to love him. And if he's my brother in Christ, it's sacrifice involved on his part and my part. But I think if we love each other where Christ intends, one, we get to hear each other. I think one, we have patience with each other. And like Gary said earlier, we learn from each other. So I think all those are really, really key ingredients to our book and why we really emphasize a cross-cultural friendship.
So, Gary, let's dive into some specifics. Talk to me about the importance of choosing the right words. How important are words when we're talking about?
Well, I think we have to recognize that different cultures may use the same word with different meanings. Like Clarence referred to earlier, you know, when I drove up in front of his house and he and James were on their porch and I got out of my car and said, "You boys ready to go?" His friend James said, "I ain't no boy." Well, you know, I was kind of shocked. And but after we talked and he told me how they felt, and Clarence told me how he felt, and, you know, that white men call their fathers boys, you know, and it was a derogatory term. I hadn't really thought of it like that. And I told them, and my side was, you know, if I were picking up two white guys at your age, I'd call them boys. You know, I was thinking age, you know, but I came to understand, you know, what that word meant to them, and they understood, you know, how my perspective on it. And after that, man, I realized it, you know, and I just, once you understand what the words mean to the other person, then if you love them, you choose your words that are going to communicate love to them rather than, you know, putting them down. So the importance of understanding what a word means to a person of a different race or culture is a part of developing a friendship.
So go ahead, Clarence.
You know, the thing was so important about that, once we had a discussion in the car that took a couple hours, you know, had he called us boy after that, we'd have been okay with it. But because he was sensitive to that, he never did. And so I think that's how you grow together.
Let's kind of learn that. Gary, how do we differentiate between friends and mere acquaintances? So how can that impact the unity?
Well, I think acquaintances is basically being polite to people. You know, you work around people of different race or different culture, If you work closely, you'll learn their name. You may learn some things about them. If they go to church, they may tell you that. You may have spiritual conversations. And you might say to another person, if they say you have a friend of a different race or culture, you'd probably say, oh, yeah, I know. Yeah, John, he works with me. And, well, I see him every day. Yeah, he's a nice guy. But he really doesn't have any depth to the relationship. They don't do anything other than at work. And there are work friendships, your friends at work, and you can't have real friendships if you talk about things other than just, how you doing today? Everything's fine. How about you? If you get into conversations about how's your family going? What is your family? Tell me about your sons, your daughters, and you can get connected and you can have a friendship, work relationship. And we talk about different levels of friendship in the book, and work relationships is one of those. But often in those work, even if they are friendships, if one of you leaves the job, the relationship probably doesn't go on. It was a friendship, but it was a work friendship. It wasn't a lifelong friendship. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, people do not have friendships. They just have acquaintances. They know the person's name and they say hi to them. They're polite to them, but there's no depth to their relationship.
Does that matter as far as unity goes? Does that matter as far as, should we treat anybody different if they're a friend or acquaintance as it relates to race or culture or unity?
Well, I think friendship begins with the word courtesy. That word comes from two Greek words. One of them means the mind, and the other means friend. So to be courteous is to be friendly minded. That is, treat the person as though they were your friend. And if you treat people as though they were your friend, they might become your friend. So you think in terms of, how would I treat them if they were a friend? Well, you might invite them out to lunch if they were a real friend. Well, maybe you could invite this person to lunch after you've gotten to know each other a little bit. So I think it starts with that. And we choose our attitude toward other people. And if we have an attitude of courtesy, that, Lord, I want to speak to everybody and relate to everybody of different cultures and races as though they were a friend of mine. And that's where I think friendship begins, just by being courteous to each other.
Good. Clarence, how did Jesus initiate cross-cultural relationships? What did you bring in? How'd you bring Jesus into the book?
Well, I actually took some stuff from my first book, Winning the Race to Unity, where it asks the question, is racial reconciliation really working? And I talk about Jesus and his encounter with a Samaritan woman. And, Jesus intentionally walked through Samaria, which is really against Jewish tradition. So he broke a Jewish tradition to walk through Samaria. Then he broke another Jewish tradition by speaking to a Samaritan woman, which made him ceremonially unclean. But what he did was he met her on her turf, and he even gave her opportunity to reject him, but he stayed and built a relationship. So he just treated her with power. He treated her with respect. And I think that really transformed her perspective. And he talked about her, but he didn't judge her. And so I think she felt safe with him. And so I think in cross-cultural relationships, we have to take some risks, because for Jesus and the disciples were with him, he knew because he was God. So he was omniscient, knew everything. But for a lot of us, he took risks that the disciples could have walked away. So I can't believe going through Samaria. I can't believe talking to his woman, all the stuff like that. But he took those risks because she was worth it. So I think when Gary developed a friendship with me, he took some risks, because when he had me come to his house, which is one thing that friends do, because he'd been to my house, I saw how some of his neighbors looked at him, and it concerned me for his safety. But he made me part of, he had me over for dinner. I met Shelly and Derek, his daughter and son, when they were really little. And in my culture, when you invite somebody to our house, that's a big deal. And it says, I respect you, but I'm receiving you as an equal. So I think the cross-cultural piece, you have to be intentional with it.
Clarence, what about this? What are some first practical steps of having, we've done, kind of talked through that a little bit, but from your perspective, what are some good first practical steps for some great cross-cultural friendships?
Well, I think like Gary said, I think the first thing is just greet the person. Just say, hello, how are you doing? And then after they respond, because it may be fine, which is the American response to how are you doing, ask them, hey, maybe where you go to work or what do you do? And you begin to probe just a little bit more than you normally do. And if they seem to be open to that, then you just can talk more. And the same way you would with someone of the same culture. Mm-hmm. But you're doing something. As you do that, they may look and say, or you may walk the same direction and say, hey, I'm really enjoying talking with you. Is there a chance we could talk some more, maybe meet for coffee or something like that? That's kind of non-threatening, and see where it goes. But it's just, like he said, courtesy. I think respect's important. And it's asking maybe one or two additional questions. You just don't let it go as I'm fine. And, so you begin to do that. One of my friends who was white, met an African-American guy at the gas station. And they both were driving minivans, but they both were really big guys. And so the white guy told the black guy, said, hey, well, I'm not really crazy about this minivan. The guy said, me either, but I've got 5 kids. And so the guy said, well, I got 4. And they laughed. And they both would rather drive trucks. But through that, they developed a relationship. And the white guy actually pursued the black guy because they talked enough to where he knew where he worked. And he found where he worked. And they started having lunch together. Found they both were Christians, and now they're really good friends. So one of you has to take the initiative. You start with something simple, which may have in common, and you just pursue it.
Gary, you mentioned conflict earlier. What are some ways to resolve conflict with a cross-cultural friend?
Well, I think, first of all, you have to listen. You have to listen to each other, because each of us, whatever the topic, each of us has a perception, and we think it's right. That's what conflict's all about. I think I'm right. You think you're right. And that's when we have to really listen to each other. Tell me your perspective, and how did you develop this perspective? Where did it come from? Have you always felt this way, or is this a new idea for you? Just listening to them, let them share. You, not with a view to responding, not with a view to shooting them down, but with a view to understanding them. And when you ask enough questions and let them share their side, and you try to look at the world through their eyes, you really can come to the place where you can say, I'm beginning to see what you're saying, and I can see how that perspective makes sense. I really never thought of it that way. But now, understanding you and your history and the way you've interpreted this, it's making sense to me. And now let me share my side so you can understand me, and then we'll talk about maybe where we go from here. And so then you listen to me in the same way. You're empathetic with what I'm saying, trying to understand it from my side. And then we can both honestly say, we understand each other now, and we see why you feel that way. So how can we solve this? What can we do to solve this conflict? Mm-hmm. And when two people are looking for a solution, they'll find one. If you're trying to win an argument with somebody, chances are you're not going to win the argument. And even if they capitulate and say, well, have it your way, they lost and you won. You don't build relationships by somebody being a loser and somebody being a winner. Mm-hmm. We're not in a friendship to win or lose. We're in a friendship to understand each other, learn how to work together with each other, and together make the world a better place because of what we're discovering in our relationship with each other.
Good.
And I think I'd like to join in that. And when you have understanding, what it really does, it alleviates frustration. It's just like in a marriage situation, when your wife or your husband, you don't understand each other, you get frustrated easily. But once you understand, that takes that frustration. And I think the other thing that's really important, understanding does not equal agreement. But I think sometimes when we understand, it can open the door for agreement down the road. Or we may never agree, but we just do understand. So I think that's important to add to that as well.
Good. Clarence, what are some ways, you guys have been through many seasons together over decades. What are some ways to make friendships last, cross-cultural friendships last over life seasons?
Wow. I think, one thing Gary has said, he had his kids praying for me. When he was doing my ordination service, he was doing the sermon, and I never knew that. He's had me over to the house. His wife, Carolyn, has had concerns for me outside of Gary about different things. And they sort of just made me family. And I think you do that. I think with Gary, I learned to trust him. My father died when I was 20. And Gary sort of stepped in without forcefully doing it. He sort of stepped in. He was always available to me. So I think a trust factor is really important, that I trusted him. I knew he loved me. And again, like he said, I never anticipated we would have a friendship. I guess at this point, it's 54 years, Gary, that would last this long. I just think we just kind of, what friends do, you just have that relationship, and doesn't mean you talk every day, but when things come up, I would say, hey, Gary, what do you think about this? Or sometimes, he's been in my kitchen and said, hey, God put you in my mind about this. What do you think about that? And it's just that you stay in that relationship, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
They're always in your mind, maybe not every day, but they become part of you to some extent.
How much of it is intentional? Like, I'm going to be intentional about asking the question and checking on this person. And how much of it is intentionality?
Well, I think intentionality is important, but it's not necessarily that we're saying, I've got to make this friendship with this person because I want to, have a friendship with someone of a different race or culture. It's not that you're forcing yourself to do something. Mm-hmm. It's that you're recognizing that in our culture, we have a lot of stress over racial things. And so we're just saying, God, if you want me to have a friendship, bring somebody across my path that I can at least be kind to, I can have a conversation with, and I can see if it might develop into a friendship. In fact, I was talking to a pastor, and I asked him if he had any friends of a different race or culture. And he said, yeah. He said, I think he said 3 close friends who are black pastors. And I said, well, how'd you develop a friendship with them? And he said, well, our churches got together for a prayer breakfast, just pastors, and we all were sitting at different tables, and they were different races at different tables. And he said, I met these 3 pastors there, and we spent some time, sharing needs. And there was another white guy there too, and we prayed with each other and just learned some things that we could pray for each other when we were apart. And he said, so I started praying for them; they started praying for me. And he said, then I just thought, I'm going to have lunch with these guys individually and see if I can get to know them. And he said, we started having lunches together. And the more and more we learned about each other's family and the children's needs and that sort of thing. And we got really, really close. And he said, so a couple of years ago, when things kind of blew up in our country racially, he said, I could freely call any one of them. And he said, I did. I called all of them, said, hey, guys, help me understand what's going on here. And how should I be responding? What's good and what's bad, and what would help, what won't help, He said, but if I hadn't developed that friendship with them, I wouldn't have called them out of the blue and said, hey, I'm a white pastor, you're black, tell me what's going on. Yeah, it just wouldn't have happened. Right. But because we had developed that friendship, he said, I could freely and openly call them, And he said, to me, that's the value. So how did it start with them? It started as an organized meeting when they were sitting down with people, So it can happen anywhere. It can happen in sports, it can happen in school, it can happen in work, it can happen in the community in which you live. So I think if we just got an open mind to it and are thinking about it and asking God to guide us, then chances are we will develop a friendship.
So let's talk to pastors and leaders specifically. So this podcast is about helping you with your worship experience on Sunday. So let's bring everything that we've learned into that. So Gary, let me get your thoughts on that. How can we use these tools that you guys have written about in the book as we craft our worship experiences on the weekend? So how can this relate to a large group gathering at church?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing would be what Clarence was talking about earlier, and that is use the scriptures to talk about the value of people of all races and cultures, and that we're going to spend eternity together in heaven. And wouldn't it be nice? We got acquainted while we were down here, with some people who were different from us. I think, waving it into the sermons, taking right out of the scriptures with the biblical illustrations of that sort of thing. I think sometimes pastors are thinking only of, well, we need to get more people who are not like us into our church. Well, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, to be sure. But even that can be a problem if you're not developing friendships with each other, And so I think talking about this aspect of race relations and giving that vision to the people in their church of, let's just think in the next 6 months here and be praying individually about someone that we maybe already have a contact with. Maybe we've taken a few more steps and seeing if it might develop into a friendship. So, I don't know, Clarence, you might want to add to that, but that's my first thoughts.
Well, I think it's really important because I know a lot of people of color who will go to predominantly white churches. A lot of times they don't feel like they go for the preaching, but they don't always feel like they're really part of the church because they don't feel welcomed and they don't feel like they have a lot of friendships. And so Gary's right. You can get numbers there, but only when you begin to have friendships. So what one church has started to do is say, hey, just shake hands with those who are around you as you leave church. And what they've done in that particular congregation, they're shaking everybody's hands so people feel welcome and feel a little bit closer. The pastor kind of makes it his job, if he sees one of a different culture, to go and personally greet them or make sure someone on staff greets them, make them feel welcome. Hey, we're glad you're here, and just build a relationship. And sometimes they say, hey, can we invite you for coffee or whatever, and get to know and hear and listen. So as they're leading the congregation, they begin to lead and develop an inclusive mindset, a cross-cultural mindset that just makes people who are of different races and culture feel at home. At the same time, they're teaching their congregation this is important. So, and I do think what Gary says is important. If they begin to preach out of the scriptures, because there's so many cross-cultural relationships in the Bible, but we talk about that more as opposed to assuming they're all one race, then I think it will help people to feel more at home and relaxed. And when churches exchange pulpits, I think that's great. But I think even better ideas is exchange choirs and have choirs come together and work on a song together, because you're going to have conflict because you can have different styles of music, but they can produce a music piece together through some conflict. It's going to really build a strong bond.
So how important is that? And also how important, Clarence, is having diversity on your staff or on your stage on a consistent basis? Well,
if you're going to have a diverse church, you got to have diverse leadership. I mean, that's really important. And the pastor can't just be over music, because it's a stereotype that blacks just do music, and it can't just be the outreach pastor. You need to have one of your teaching pastors as a person of color, because then you're speaking to the people that this person is part of our leadership. This is what we do. It's kind of like the church at Antioch. So that's critical, because if you see a church that has a diverse staff, they'll be reflected in the congregation. It'll begin to grow people, not just cross culture, but they'll cross economic diversity as well. And that's what really builds a church relationship.
Good. Gary, do you have anything to add to that? And then I'm going to play a rapid fire question game with you, and then I'll let you go.
Okay. No, I do think that pastors as leaders can help people get a vision for what we're talking about in this book. And all those things that Clarence mentioned, all those are part of it. And there's no one thing that you can do to make that happen. But if we began to build friendships, and people in our church would build friendships, there's no telling where this could lead in terms of bringing healing in our country. So that's our passion.
Good. All right, I'm going to hit you with some rapid fire. You ready? Five real quick hits. All right, Gary, these are going to come out of left field. Here we go. Gary, what's the craziest question that you've gotten about love languages? What question has stumped you?
Well, I've heard all of them, I think. The one that didn't stump me, but the one I hear most often is, can your love language change through the years? And my answer is, I think it tends to stay with us for a lifetime, like many other personality traits. However, in certain seasons of life, for example, a mother who has 2 preschool children, acts of service may not be her primary language, but during those years, it's probably going to jump to the top because she's overwhelmed. So I think it can change in certain seasons and certain circumstances.
Good. All right. Did Oprah ask you anything that stumped you?
No,
didn't you do several? At least one Oprah thing.
I
just did one with her.
Okay.
She was very open, and we had a great conversation. She actually took the quiz right there on the program, online quiz, and it turned out that it was words of affirmation. So
you told her good job. You said good job.
So when I finished that thing, I gave her some words of affirmation because she did a great job.
There you go. All right, Clarence, here coming at you. What is something that if pastors or leaders would do right now, it would have an immediate impact on cross-cultural relationships or unity in their church?
Well, I think they talked about it. I think if they talked about it, I would even take this Samaritan woman and Jesus' encounter with her and preach about that and talk in the context of cross-cultural relationships, also in respecting women. I think that'd be a win-win for a pastor without it being a volatile, controversial deal. And just ask the question, hey, how can we develop a relationship with people who are different from us? And are we willing to take some risks and some practical steps? I think if they preach about that right away, I think it'd be huge. And also read those 6 steps you talk about in the book of how to do that. I think it'd be huge.
Good. Gary, where will we find you on a day off? Where will we find you on a day off? What'd you say? No day off?
I'm officially retired as of last July after 50 years in the same church, okay? But they let me keep my office. They let me keep my assistant. I'm in here every day when I'm in town. And when I'm out of town, I'm speaking. I relax.
What's a great hobby? What's your favorite hobby? I'll put it that way.
Well, my hobby is in summer and spring is cutting kudzu.
Okay.
Kudzu, grows in the southeast all over trees and kills the trees.
Yeah.
So 2 or 3 mornings a week, I go down for an hour in the woods and just cut the kudzu and save the trees, and just God and I out there alone. That's my hobby.
Good. Love it. Clarence, what's your secret talent? What's a talent that nobody knows you have?
Well, some people have actually said I have a good voice, for singing. So when I was part of the youth choir, I wouldn't believe her at the time, but my mom said, you have a really good voice. I just don't like you singing that rock and roll stuff. And then I've heard other people in the music. Every now and then I'll slip up and they'll say, hey, you got a pretty nice voice. You ought to work on that. So that's probably hidden talent that I don't.
There you go. All right. Last question for both of you. Gary, you go first on this one. What's your favorite TV show that you binge? What's Gary Chapman watching on Netflix or TV?
I don't binge on anything on TV, to be very honest with you. I do watch the neighborhood show, where the black and white couple live beside each other. I do watch that rather regularly. But I'm not a big TV fan, to be honest with you.
Okay.
But I do like that program because it brings up a lot of issues that are real healthy.
Clarence, what about you?
Well, last time I binged on something, it was actually the show The Chosen.
Oh, yeah.
By Dallas Jenkins. That was really, really good. I do like Blue Bloods. I'll watch that. In fact, an episode a year ago, they actually used the 5 love languages in one of their episodes. So I watched that because it has a wholesome family dinner table deal, which is kind of cool.
Do you ever think that Tom Selleck would be using your material, Gary?
There's a lot of people using my material.
There you go. Oprah or Tom Selleck. Well, thank you guys.
That's a God thing.
There you go. All right. Well, the book is out now, and thank you guys so much for coming on. Life-changing cross-cultural friendships, how you can heal racial divides one relationship at a time. It's available now wherever books are sold. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Carl. Good to be with you.
Hey guys, Matt McMorris here, pastor of Grace Valley Church. I just want to tell you, one of the reasons I love 1230 Media is because when we started our church, I wanted to have good video content and sermons and bumpers and that kind of stuff, but just couldn't afford to pay somebody, to hire somebody to do that kind of stuff for us. And so the affordability and the fact that they're constantly coming out with new stuff, they're really helping equip our church. We used their stuff today in a service. We just got done with church, and love being able to have that resource and being able to plan sermons and things that have quality digital to help our services be as sharp and professional as they can be. I highly recommend 1230 Media.
The show notes for this episode are available now at makingsundayhappen.com.
Next week on the podcast, we're going to be talking to my friend Jason Moore. Jason has been on the podcast a number of times, and this time we talk about his latest workshop and book, Both and Maximizing Hybrid Worship Experiences for In-Person and Online Engagement. Jason and I agree on a lot of this material. In fact, we both have been teaching very similar content on this subject over the past year or two. We take a deep dive into Jason's book on hybrid worship and why we both think that you should have an incredible in-person gathering and also an incredible online experience as well. There's multiple ways that you can do that, and we talk about all of those options and all of that material next week. It's a very thorough episode of the podcast, very informative, all about hybrid worship experiences. That's next week on the show. Well, if you haven't joined our YouTube channel, feel free to subscribe today or follow us on social media. Be sure to jump into all that. We love connecting with you on the socials. Lots of great content and free resources there as well. Well, go out there and create some incredible worship experiences this weekend. I'll catch you next week.
Making Sunday Happen is a production of the ministry of 1230 Media. For show notes, archive episodes, and more free resources for your church, visit MakingSundayHappen.com.